Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Flaningan, and I'm the director of the AFA Visual Arts program at Caldwell Community College. And today we're going to be doing a cell phone photography workshop, and this one is geared for ages 16 to 22. So we're going to go over some compositional structures and then also branch into some more conceptual prompts to push your thinking a little further into the fine art world. So to get started, I want to explain a few kind of basics of what's happening inside your camera when you're making a photograph. So in your cell phone, we can't control all of these elements perfectly, although they're getting better every day. But we want to understand at least what's happening inside of your camera when you're making a photograph. And so we talk about this as the exposure triangle. There's three elements. They each deal with light. So the most important thing when you're making a photograph is light and how it enters your camera. And each of these things affects how much light comes into your camera, but it also has a sort of side effect that gives you a visual idea. And so one or the other will be what you will focus on depending on what kind of image you want to make and what you're trying to come across in the images that you're making as well. So we'll go through each of them briefly. If you have a SLR camera or a fancier camera, you'll be able to change these settings a little bit more dramatically. The first one is shutter speed, and it's the one that you actually do have a little bit of control over in your cell phone. And so shutter speed is the amount of time that your camera's shutter remains open when taking a photograph. It controls the amount of time that we capture light for, and it allows us to freeze or blur motion. So that freeze and blur motion part is the side effect that comes with shutter speed. So your camera shutter opens and light comes into your camera. If it's only open for a second, not a lot of light comes in. If it's open for 10 seconds, more light can come in. If your camera's shutter is open for a whole day, it will be probably so much light that you will only see white on your camera's frame. In your cell phone, you can play with this a little bit. Usually it's some sort of night mode where you're able to make your camera's shutter open for usually up to about 10 seconds. So that would be the first one that you could play around with. Usually it doesn't show up unless you're in a room that already has lower lighting. And then you'll see it kind of pop up as a night mode with 3 seconds up to 10 seconds. And so you can kind of play around with that to use shutter speed. And so there's not a right or a wrong way to make a photograph when you're thinking about shutter speed. You can see how this pinwheel is frozen on one side with a fast shutter speed, and it's blurred on the other side with a slow shutter speed. And neither one of these means that your camera or your photograph is bad. It's just an aesthetic choice. But you want to understand how to make it happen so that if you want this blurry effect to happen, you know how to make that happen inside of your camera. This is an example from Harold Edgerton, and what he's doing is a little bit more unique. He's leaving his camera shutter open for a very long time, and then he's using a strobe light and flashing it at this subject as they swing this tennis racket above their head. And so we get a stopped motion repeatedly instead of a full blurred motion. But he's still using shutter speed in a unique way to create a visually intriguing image here. This is an example from a student. And so usually if you have blur in an image and something frozen in the image, you have to use a tripod so the camera itself isn't moving. In this case, the student just tried to stay very, very still, and their subject kicked one foot while they didn't kick the other foot. So you've got one still foot and one blurred foot, which is a kind of fun way to think about playing with shutter speed in your camera. The next side of the exposure triangle is aperture. I'll move myself off of the written part of this slide here. It says that aperture is in a mechanical sense, refers to the size of the opening at the back of the lens, which controls how much light is being passed onto the camera sensor. Aperture is often called f-stop, and it is important to the exposure of your photograph, but it also affects how much of your image is in focus or the depth of field. This is an important stylistic choice and impacts the look and feel of your images. So that's the sort of side effect that we're talking about here. Let me go back one. This is the size of the hole in your lens that's letting light in. So shutter speed is how much time. Aperture is how big the hole is it's letting light in. So you could think about passing water through a straw or passing water through a fire hose. They're going to let in significantly more or less water. That's the same thing that's happening with your aperture. In your cell phone, it is a fixed aperture most of the time. So you're not going to be able to change this in a literal sense, but most cameras have some sort of filter that kind of plays with a mimicking of depth of field. It's usually called portrait mode, and it is a digital filter that tries to guess what would be considered the background. So sometimes it doesn't get it perfectly right, but it's going to make it look kind of similar to what this shallow depth of field would look like. And when we're talking about depth of field, you're kind of thinking about slicing space into bigger or smaller sections. So that's what's being explained in this image. If your aperture is f1.8, that's a really big hole on your lens, letting in a lot of light, and it's making the image have a really shallow depth of field. So only the flower is in focus and everything in the background is blurred out. It's an aesthetic choice, not a right or wrong. And then it's going up here. So as the image is getting more and more in focus, the aperture is getting smaller and smaller on your camera lens. Here are some examples. So we're going to look at examples from more well-known photographers and then some from students as well. So you can kind of get a wide range of ideas. This is an example from Daniel Seth Krause. And so he's using that blurred background as an aesthetic choice to make all of our focus really sit on the subject here. All we're looking at is the person, and that background just becomes kind of a texture back there. This is an example from a student. So we're making that brick wall either in focus with a deep depth of field or out of focus with a much shallower depth of field. Another student example, and this one I think is a really great example because it shows how this side effect can make or break a photograph. So like we said, there's not a right or a wrong in every case, but there is a right or wrong for specific images sometimes. And so the image on the left is a much more clear image to me in that it tells me what is important or what the photographer thought was important. So in focus is that little bit of a plant in those fingers in the foreground, and the background just becomes texture. It tells me what's important, what's the focal point. The image on the right, I can't really even tell what is in the person's fingers because it just blends into the background there. So this is why these elements of the exposure triangle can become really important because you want to know how to change them so that you can get the image the way you want it to be as a maker and as an artist. ISO is the last one here. ISO is a camera setting that allows you to introduce more light into the scene, creating brighter images. At the same time, ISO affects the amount of grain or noise in the image. And so those words are used kind of interchangeably in photography, grain and noise. And it sort of looks like speckles all over the image. You may have seen it in some images that you've made or that you've seen on the internet. As you bring up that ISO, you're able to make images in less and less light, but you're also going to start introducing that grain or noise. This is one of the things that makes a camera much more expensive is if it has a much wider ISO range to it. It also is language that comes from film speeds originally. And so if you were to go out and buy a film camera, you can still buy film in a lot of these film speeds. And so you would have to shoot the entire roll at that one ISO and then change out the whole roll of film if you wanted a different amount of sensitivity to light in your camera. Here's a really low light example from M. White and a much, much brighter image from Woodling Cadet. And so you're kind of thinking about how would you set that ISO if you're going to be outside in the sun versus inside in the dark. Again, not something you can make a big change on in your cell phone, but something to understand is happening. That sensitivity to your camera's sensor to light is happening inside of all cameras. This is a statement that I think is really important, especially as we branch into some of the conceptual sides of what photography can be. Tools are simply tools. Artists make art with whatever tools they have available. You don't need fancy gear to make important, interesting, and beautiful images. And so this is an example that a student has made using that portrait mode that we were talking about. So it's not a true depth of field, but the portrait mode. It's a pretty compelling image, if you ask me. This is something I believe really wholeheartedly. I make images on scanner beds. I make images with plastic cameras. I really don't believe that money factor of gear should affect whether or not an artist can make something that tells a story and tells a really beautiful and important one. An example of that is Joshua White, who's a photographer in Ashe County, North Carolina, and an educator at Appalachian State University. And this is a series he made using his cell phone. So it is very possible to make artwork with your cell phone. It's a series called A Photographic Survey of the American Yard. And he has made thousands of these images of bugs and plants. And he originally did it in Instagram and used the early bird filter in Instagram. And then this actually ended up being published in National Geographic and has been exhibited all around the US and has been sold in many different galleries as well. So it's very possible to use this tool that might seem hard to use to make something really intriguing. These are some examples that students have made in some of my classes in the past. And so more examples of how you could use this. These are all done on cell phones. And that was from a prompt I used to give so that students would realize and understand that your tools are just tools. So these are all kitchen objects that were photographed in this sort of noir film style that is really beautiful. The student did a great job. This is another cool example. The student used a lot of filters and editing apps in their phone, and they were interested in photographing the insides of trash cans and making a whole series that had various amounts of trash or no trash in them. So that image on the far left is going to be an empty trash can, and then the rest of them kind of piled up with more or less depending on the time of day. This example is a student who is using colored lights and in a dark space to make really intriguing compositions. These are also cropped to a square, which Josh's were and Aiden's were. And so that's a way you can kind of play around with composition as well, is by taking those cell phone images and making them cropped into different perspectives, different proportions would be the better word to use there. And then this example, the student took photographs out in the world and then on their tablet drew these little characters into the photographs. And so all of this is done with kind of not intense software. I believe they used Procreate to make the little drawings of the people. And all the photographs were ones that they had taken on their cell phone as well. We're going to kind of break into these elements of photographic composition, and I'm going to pause after each chunk, roughly 4 elements at a time, and give you a chance to make some yourself. I always tell people I learn best by doing, and I see in my students most of the time that that is true across the board. And so just sitting here and watching this video in its entirety, a lot of times we'll lose some of the things that we're learning. So I really encourage you, if you have the time, to pause when I do and try out these ideas on your own and see if they work for you. So we're talking about composition here. Composition is the arrangement of visual elements within a photograph. It's how photographers organize a scene to create meaning, guide the viewer's eye, and strengthen the image. This is kind of unique to photography. We sometimes talk about composition in this non-blank canvas sense. So this says, unlike a painting or a drawing, photographers begin with a world that already exists. Rather than creating every element, photographers compose by choosing where to stand, what to include, what to exclude, and when to press the shutter. Every framing decision shapes how the viewer experiences the photograph. So sometimes we talk about this as saying crop with your feet. So if you have a dumpster in the background, move closer to your subject so the dumpster isn't there anymore. These are kind of elements that we have to think about when we're photographing as opposed to drawing or painting, or we could choose to eliminate that object. In a photograph, we have to move where we are to make sure that that thing that is not aesthetically interesting is no longer in our image. The first element we're talking about is the rule of thirds. I tried to find an image of my own from my own archive to illustrate each of these to show you that I play by these rules too a lot of the time. So this says that you divide the frame into 9 equal sections using 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines. Placing key subjects along these lines or at their intersections creates stronger balance, emphasis, and visual interest. And so in this case, I've placed the subject along one of those vertical lines, and their eyes are almost at that perfect intersection here. And that tends to give us a really strong, intriguing sense of composition. It's just a rule to kind of play around with and see if you like it. In your cell phone, you can turn that grid on in your camera settings, and so you can see it while you're actually composing your images, and that gives you an idea of where you're wanting to place things within your frame. This one talks about the rule of thirds as one of the main rules in art and photographic composition. It stems from the theory that the human eye naturally gravitates to intersection points that occur when an image is split into thirds. So, a lot of times, these rules that we're talking about, they're really just rules because it's how humans already operate. It's what we're already drawn to. And so, we're just playing along with what already makes sense to the human eye and our interests. So Meg Griffiths is doing that here by putting a painting up in the top third and a bed in that bottom third as a way to kind of think about this composition. This one's a little bit weird because it's a square, but it still kind of plays along those rules. This one's a great example by Daniel Coburn, where the father's eyes that are covered by these magazine pages are almost perfectly in that bottom third, and again on that cross section, those intersecting lines that are happening in the rule of thirds. Susan Worsham, I feel like in this example, she's using the window frame that this child's looking through as almost a literal rule of thirds. It's kind of playing along and reframing a frame within the image, which is a pretty complicated or sophisticated way to think about organizing an image. It's rare that these images or any examples that we use perfectly play by the rules, but they're always kind of an approximation or something sort of close. Here's an example from a student that's incredibly literal. So you could think about kind of starting in the literal and then seeing how far out you can pull yourself to play by these rules. The next one that we're going to look at is patterns. Pattern is the repetition of visual elements such as shapes, colors, textures, or objects. Repeating elements can create rhythm, emphasize order, or draw the viewer's eye through the image. This is my own example where I'm photographing leaves from underneath a clear roof, and those repeating shapes of kind of similarities of the leaves create a pattern or a visual kind of repetition that helps move our eyes around the image. This Daniel Seth Krauss image, I love this image. It is a stained glass window in a church that's being reflected onto a TV screen, and I kind of love the way it plays also conceptually with this modern technology and this very ancient art form being like playing off of each other with the reflections in this screen. Here's another example from his series that deals with churches in Florida, and it has the patterns as these vacuum cleaner lines across the church carpets here. So you can kind of create pattern or try to find it out in the world. Keisha Scarville has a whole series that's called Mama's Clothes, in which she wraps herself in clothes that were left to her by her mother. And she's chosen a technique that works really well for pattern, which is making the image black and white. So we're not distracted by some of the other elements that happen when you use a color image. And we're really just looking at those really almost harsh patterns here. They feel like they're all black and white. We don't know whether they were or not because that's the only way that they're presented to us by the artist. Hagen Pearson's series here. This is about consumption of soda. And so he's using the repeated can to kind of talk about how much of it gets consumed. So you can use pattern in a way that is visual and in a way that is conceptual. Andreas Gursky is doing the same thing. So he's really interested in the ideas of consumerism. And so he often photographs inside Amazon facilities or other factories, or in this case, a supermarket, showing just the mass amount of objects that exist in those spaces. And when it's as zoomed out as he's doing, we almost turn those shapes into a repeating pattern visually. Daniel Coburn is using these spheres and the shadows that they cast to create a repeated sphere in the image. Daniel Everett is doing this in a post-editing. So probably in Photoshop for him, we could do a lot of these things in our phone, though. There's lots of editing apps you can use. So he's photographing all these cityscapes and then kind of cutting them apart and reassembling them. And what I think is interesting here is it's hard to figure out what is the top and what is the bottom in the image itself. Here's an example from a student. So they're finding patterns in shadows cast by chairs and tables outside. Similar thing here, finding pattern through light cast on the wall. The next one is texture, and texture refers to the visual quality of a surface as seen through variation in detail, shape, tone, and color. In photography, texture can create depth, emphasize material qualities, and make a two-dimensional image feel more tactile. And so in this case, this kind of smooth, calm water feels soft. It doesn't feel like anything crazy or aggressive happens. It sort of feels quiet. And so that texture is feeding those concepts as well. Joshua White's image has this very uh, intense texture across the surface. It's almost exclusively texture in this image. There's really nothing else there for us to view but focus on that texture there. In this case, we've got this kid whose pajamas perfectly match his blanket, and the texture feels soft or velvety, feels calm, quiet again. The softness of the light also tends to feed that feeling. And then in this case, Nadia Sablin's using fur, and so it's kind of a texture we know. And then adding in those hands also tells us to think about how it feels and to imagine what the person in the image might be touching and feeling and experiencing. Here's some examples from students. So we've got a pretty rough texture here, another pretty rough texture with that burlap. The next one that we're looking at here is symmetry. And symmetry occurs when an element on either side of an axis mirror one another. In photography, symmetrical compositions create balance, harmony, and a sense of order within the frame. So if you could cut this photograph down the middle, we'd have almost a mirror image on either side. Again, not a perfect example, but a very close to perfect example. Another one that's kind of a little off, but we get the idea that if we cut this in the middle, at least that visual weight is similar on either side. And using a literal mirror tends to help with playing around with symmetry. Elizabeth McGrady here, she's a small figure in the middle, directly in the middle, and then even that background is kind of scooping in a perfect symmetrical form so that if we folded this image in half, it would be roughly the same on either side. Another Susan Worsham example here. This one almost has a radial symmetry, meaning it's kind of the same in every direction. It's not perfect, but it's close. Similar here for Keith Carter's. And here's a student example using the mirror as a literal tool to create a sense of symmetry. Another one where the only real thing in the image is directly in the center. So going back to that rule of thirds, there's not a right or wrong way to make a photograph, but there is a reason and a time to use any one of these elements. Another directly in the center symmetrical image here. So this is where I talked about how we would take a pause and give you a chance to kind of try this out for yourself. So take 15 minutes, pause this video, go out and make a photograph that represents each of these photographic compositional elements that we've already learned about. So a rule of thirds, a pattern, a texture, and a symmetry. And see if you can make that happen. And when you finish with that, come back and we'll go to the next section. So already here, the exact opposite of symmetry, there's a time and a place to use this element. Asymmetry occurs when elements in a composition are not mirrored or evenly distributed. Photographers use asymmetry to create tension, movement, and visual interest while still maintaining balance within the frame. I love this example here. Using something in the frame to kind of purposefully split something up is a great way to think about asymmetry. So they're using this water glass to almost split this face and disjoint it and make it not feel like a perfect mirrored image. Latoya Ruby Frazier, this is a cool example because if that person in the foreground was removed, it would be a pretty much symmetrical image. But as they've added this additional figure in, we have all the visual weight kind of pulling to one side of the image. They're also using an interesting technique by having there be a white background behind that figure and a darker background on the other side. So again, this visual weight, or where our eyes are naturally drawn, is happening kind of all over the frame and our eyes move around the image. Patricia Swanson, this bug is down in the bottom weighted corner, creating that clear sense of asymmetry. A student example here, and what I think is interesting about this is it again sort of feeds the concept, makes it feel like this vehicle is stuck or kind of off kilter. Maybe it ran off the road, and using that asymmetry really makes that feeling occur. Another really cool example of playing with objects, playing with mirrors, playing with glasses to make the images have this really strange sense or sensibility to them. This one also plays with that shallow depth of field concept that we already talked about as well. Here's another great student example of asymmetry. The next one is light. So light is the foundation of photography. The camera captures how light interacts with a subject. By adjusting the position and quality of natural or artificial light, photographers can dramatically alter the mood, form, texture, and meaning of an image. And so in this one, I used a really literal example. This is from a film camera that I use, and light leaked into the camera. And that's what the term for it is called, a light leak. And so light kind of took over and almost like ate my image, and it creates this really harsh environment. And is that example of using light in a way to kind of frame an image or frame what we want the viewer to look at. This is also my image because I wanted to give you one that was a little bit more subtle of an example. And so by placing your subject really close to an open window, like I've done here, we have a strong sense of light coming in onto her face and giving us a directional light pouring across the figure. Gregory Crutzen is really well known for creating almost like film sets. So this is not done in Photoshop. This is done physically in a space. And so he's cutting these holes in the floor and shining light up through it. So you can play with light artificially like this, or naturally by just placing a subject by a window or finding sunlight or shadow out in the world. Elizabeth McGrady is doing that opposite thing, finding the light that's coming through windows or already existing out in the world, and framing her composition around that light that already exists. Hannah Altman also using light from windows very frequently, and in these cases, really telling us what is important and where to look in the image, casting beautiful shadows, casting color onto the floor, all of those things using light as a tool and as a ingredient to these photographs. Ashley Kausinger loves that window light. That's always a beautiful kind of soft sense of light. Here's a student example. So it's going to be really easy to find natural light on a very bright day where you can find harsh shadows and bright brights. Otherwise, you might think about using lamps inside so that you can have a directional sense of light. Another great student example on a bright sunny day. And a little bit softer of an example here, kind of capturing and finding that light out in the world. Lines is our next element. Lines are visual pathways that organize a photograph and influence how the viewer moves through the image. By using natural or created lines, photographers can lead attention toward a subject, create depth, or suggest movement and emotion. This is a cool example because they're using that line to draw our eye from the bottom of the image to the subject and then push our view outside of the frame to kind of continue its movement there. So you're kind of putting this person in the middle or in the center of attention by drawing this line around them and placing them literally on it. Shauna Caldwell here, these images feel like they play off of each other to me, where there's really small lines in one image, really big lines in the other, but that subtle use of color also connects the images back and forth. So we've got verticals and color kind of making the images feel like they belong together. A student example here, so they're using light as a way to create lines. So as you go out into the world, you'll start to make these images and see that many of the elements appear in your images. And that is great if you've got multiple elements showing up all in one photograph, all in one image. Using light again to create this sense of a line. It doesn't have to be a literal line, but just the sense of one. Contrast is our next element here. Contrast occurs when opposing elements are placed together within an image. Strong differences in light, color, texture, or subject matter can create depth, emphasize a focal point, and shape the mood of a photograph. So this photograph was made on a paper negative, which already has high contrast, so we lose a lot of the middle gray tones. We have dark blacks and much brighter whites, and not a lot of a tonal range in between. So they tend to be a great medium to use if you love what high contrast looks like. Here's another example of making that bright white and dark in the shadows to create a really beautiful contrast. A Latoya Ruby Frazier example here. Another Patricia Swanson. So this is a double exposure, which you can do with a film camera, but you can also do it with your digital camera, and you can do it in your cell phone. If your phone doesn't already let you do it, you can download an app that lets you do this, where you can superimpose two images together and really start to get pretty creative with what you can do inside such a simple tool. Remember, tools are just tools. Artists make art. Another student example is thinking about getting really close to something so that you can isolate this one element that you want to be a great example. So giving us whites and darks by getting rid of everything else in the frame and just focusing in on this one little section. Turning the lights off in a room and then letting light come through just a window can also create this heightened contrast and also tends to create a heightened drama. So if you want a more dramatic image, high contrast should help out with that. Another student example, this one's really beautiful. And then another way to kind of think about this is by finding things that already have high contrast. So this is a black and white article of clothing, I think. And so it already is going to have that high contrast because that's all that is in the image already is black or white. Color is another example here. Color is the element of art created by light and defined by hue, value, and saturation. In photography, color shapes mood, directs attention, creates contrast, and communicates meaning. Photographers can emphasize or alter color through lighting, white balance, camera settings, and post-processing to influence how an image is experienced. So you may have picked up on all the examples that have my name next to them that I pretty much exclusively photograph in black and white. So I had to really search to think of how to show you how I might use color. And this is the way that I've used it in the past. This is an alternative photographic process called chromoskedesic sabatier. And it's a process where you're painting chemistry onto your black and white darkroom print while you're still in the darkroom. And so it's a way to introduce color that isn't really the real colors that you would find in the world. And that's just my preference. Everybody else can find the ways that they like playing with color. Whitling Cadet is one of my favorite photographers, and I love this image. So think about how you could set up an image that really plays with color. Maybe that means going through your house and finding everything that's red or finding everything that's yellow and building a still life and then making a photograph of that. And that's a great way that you can play with color. She's built this set outside and then brought in actors to wear clothes that really match the background and has built this image from the ground up. I love Evelyn's work as well. All of her work is sort of eerie or strange, and I think that comes from her intentional, limited color palette. She never just has people wearing whatever they happen to be wearing. She's always going into spaces that already have almost one color, and it makes them feel like off-putting even, in a really strange way that I think is beautiful and intriguing. And then Mary Ellen Bartley is doing a similar thing, maybe even more extreme, where she is using the complete absence of color to create a composition. So this image isn't black and white in the fact that she turned it to black and white, but there is really only white in the image. And then you get a little bit of an off-white or a tan in there too in these stacks of books. So think about how you could eliminate color as a choice in your compositions as well. Heather Evans Smith does the same thing with the color blue, and she has a whole photographic series where she's always kind of hunting out or searching for this color blue and building beautiful compositions that also highlight that one color. So again, we're going to pause here. You're going to take 15 minutes to make a photograph that represents each of the elements that we just looked at: asymmetry, light, lines, contrast, and color. Now you can see why I'm giving you breaks. It'd be so hard to remember all of these in one fell swoop. So take a break now, try to make some of these. When you're finished with that, come back and we'll keep going. The last little chunk here of thinking about the actual elements of how you compose an image is perspective. So this says that where you are in relation to your subject shapes the image. Subjects photographed from above have a different impact than those photographed from below. So this is a really important thing when we're thinking about how we're going to make a photograph, is where am I in relationship to what I'm making a picture of. So the first one is bird's eye view, and a bird's eye view places the camera above the subject, like you are a bird. You're from an elevated perspective. This angle can make a subject appear smaller or more vulnerable, create a sense of separation, or position the viewer as an observer looking into the scene. So it can almost make you feel like a voyeur, kind of peeking through a window at something that's happening out into the world. So it's a great way to think about vulnerability, perhaps, photographing something from above. Sometimes it also comes with making the viewer feel like they're in a position of power. So you also want to kind of be careful with this perspective and see if you're using it in the right way. This is an example from Sally Mann. This is her child in the water. And this is another example. This is kind of illustrating that point of being careful. It makes us feel like we're looking down on this child, like they don't have any power, like they are drowning. So you could do that for a dramatic effect, but you just want to make sure that that effect matches what your intentions were and that what you want to happen is happening in your image. This one's kind of a more subtle version of that. So the photographer is just slightly above the people out in the water, making them feel, again, kind of small, almost like the world is big and they are small. That's the feeling I get when I look at it, at least. This one's even more dramatic, so it feels like maybe the photographer is in a helicopter or in a bridge that's even higher. So you could make really dramatic versions of this or really subtle versions of this. Another Woodling Cadet example. So even though I love the way that she uses color, she also uses black and white in her images, depending on what emotion she's trying to convey. Here's an example from a student getting above this rock climber on the rock so that they appear smaller. This is a great example from a student. So there's someone's really high above them. This also has a really dramatic sense of light that's making the subject very clear in the image. A much more subtle version, standing just slightly above this figure. The next one is almost the opposite of that. So a worm's eye view, as if you are a worm looking up into the world. A worm's eye view photographs a subject from below looking upward. This perspective exaggerates size and scale, often making subjects appear powerful, monumental, or imposing while placing the viewer in a more vulnerable position. So you can kind of elevate a figure by photographing them this way, or make them feel like they have a sense of power over the viewer. I think this is an interesting example thinking back to that Sally Mann image where the child's sort of drowning in the water. This is Carolyn Waterman who's photographing her child. So these are both mother to child relationships, but Carolyn is below her child and it almost makes them feel regal or royal as they descend this staircase. Daniel Coburn. This image, I think, makes the woman in this picture feel like she's condescending or like looking down at me when she is looking down her nose quite literally at me. So you can think about how you can make this aesthetic choice that brings a really strong emotion to the viewer. Same thing with the Still Margamero piece. This person feels powerful to me. They feel like they are looking down at me, are taller than me, in a higher position than me. You can play with climbing up into things like trees or onto ladders to make this a more dramatic perspective. And this is a cool example. I've got a few of these in here for you to give you the ways in which some artists use these elements to also feed a concept. So this is Kerry Skarbacka, and this is a series that he created that's called The Struggle to Write Oneself. And this is his artist statement. So sometimes you can learn a lot about what an artist is trying to do by just looking at the images. And sometimes when you read the statement that they wrote, it really helps you understand their perspectives a lot better. So this is his statement. It says, "Beyond the basic laws that govern and maintain our equilibrium, we live in a world that constantly tests our stability in various other forms. War and rumors of war, issues of economic security, effects of globalization, environmental policy, and the politics of identity are all external gravities turned inward, serving to further threaten the precarious balance of self, exaggerating negative feelings of control. This long-term project is in response to this delicate state. The exploration resides within the sublime metaphorical space where balance has been disrupted and the definitive point of no return has been met. It asks the question of what it means to resist the struggle, to simply let go. What are the consequences of holding on? Human existence as a process of perpetual falling, placing the responsibility of each individual to catch us from our own uncertainty. We are all vulnerable to losing our footing and grasp. These images convey the primal qualities of the human condition as a precarious balancing act between the struggle against our desire to survive and our fantasy to transcend our humanness." And so in all of these images, it's a whole photographic series that he's been making for years and years. He's falling from something, whether that's a ladder or from a tree. So he's really thinking about this worm's eye perspective, which seems so simple when we talk about it, and making it the centerpiece of all the ideas that he's interested in making photographs about. Here's some student examples. So thinking about laying down on the ground, photographing something that's much bigger than you. thinking about how that perspective makes us feel small. So in this case, I feel like I'm a tiny little mouse in these giant leaves by having the photographer or the student get down onto the ground and photograph inside these leaves. Another example from students. There's another student example, again, making this figure feel a little more powerful by being so much taller than us. This is another student example that I think kind of plays with what Carrie Scarbacca is talking about. We've got a metaphorical versus a literal here. Is this image literally looking up at someone, or does it simply provide the feeling of looking up to someone? So you could think about these ideas of idolization, hope, prayer, fear, or insignificance. So this student even held grass in front of the camera lens to make it feel like you were kind of nestled in and looking out and up at this sort of fatherly figure for them. Eye level is the next perspective here, and an eye level view photographs a subject from the same height as the viewer's perspective. This is a familiar viewpoint, and it creates a sense of connection, equality, and presence, allowing viewers to engage with the subject more directly. I think this one creates that intimacy because it's rare in the world that we get to actually just stare into somebody else's eyes. And so when we photograph someone like that, it gives us the chance to look into their soul in a way that always sort of is a connecting force. Richard Avedon here, this is kind of the way he photographed everyone. He would set up these white backdrops at gas stations and photograph all these different kinds of people, and he always photographed them at eye level, which kind of gave them this baseline equality across all of the images that he made. Susan Worsham, so in this case, she's having to get down lower to photograph these children laying on a bed at an eye level. So it's not about photographing from your eye level, but about photographing the subject's eye level. So make sure you're kind of thinking about that as you're making these eye level images. Nadia Sablin, this is her auntie. So she's getting down and letting us look directly into her eyes. Joshua White getting down onto the ground so that this woman feels a little bit more powerful than if you can imagine that he, as an adult person, is photographing down at her, how much different this image would feel, right? Here's a student example. So think about practicing this with your friends and family that are taller or shorter than you are and making sure that you get to their exact eye level and make an image of them that way. So this is your turn. You're going to take 15 minutes to make a photograph that represents each of the following elements of photographic composition: a bird's eye, a worm's eye, and an eye level. When you come back, we'll get into some more conceptual ideas. So those are all of the elements of photographic composition that we're going to cover today. And so I want to give you a couple of prompts that could push you into thinking more about the concepts that your photographs could embody. And so this one's just a prompt that's called Capture the Sounds. Photography is often considered a visual medium, but photographs can also suggest experiences beyond sight. How can an image communicate the sounds, smells, textures, or feelings of a place? And so in this image, we can kind of imagine how loud this city street might feel. That's kind of what they're talking about here. This also relates to this idea in art that's called the Kiki and Booba effect, which tells us that one of these shapes is Kiki and one of them is Booba, and that the vast majority of people in the world will assign those names to the same shape. And so this much sharper image tends to be thought of as Kiki, as that sound is harsh in our mouth, and this Booba sound is soft and sort of bubbly. And so we think of it as this much more rounded shape. And so we can think about those ideas and sort of translate them into photography, that if something looks harsh, it's going to feel harsh, right? And maybe think about some visuals that we have in the world. So this is the kind of three dots that appear when someone else is texting you back. And there's been a lot of discourse about how that feeling is anxiety inducing while you're waiting for that text to come through. So it's a visual that comes along with an emotion that's kind of intrinsically tied to it. This example is a photograph that feels very calm to me. I can imagine sitting in that space and only hearing the water and the wind in the trees. This is from an app that's helping you slow down your breathing. So this visual feels really different to me than that anxiety-inducing three little dots of waiting for my response. This one feels like slow down, calm down, take a minute. This image feels much louder, sort of like the first one. There's a lot of chaos going on, and it's got visual noise, meaning there's a lot of colors, there's a lot of bright lights, there's a lot going on, and it's sort of hard to tell where my eyes should go. And that's feeding into this idea of a sound as well. This one I feel like is quite obvious. You can kind of hear that cat being caught with its mouth open mid meow, telling us exactly what that sound might sound like. This one feels like a car wash to me, but maybe it's the ocean, feeling kind of loud but natural, always kind of water sounds. This one is like an in-between to me. It feels like there could be city sounds, but it feels a little more calm, or maybe we're thinking about the music that he's listening to in his headphones, what he might be experiencing as a person in the world. Similar sort of city experience here. So these are ideas that you could think about as you go and make images that represent sounds. Something like, what would a bass drop look like? Could you use blur, grain, ripple, or visual noise to represent volume or tone? You could photograph what's missing. So a microphone that's unplugged or a mouth mid-scream, sort of like that cat in the example. An empty stage. Take a photo and pair it with a sound and then reverse it. Listen first and then photograph. This is a Harold Edgerton example where he's dropping milk onto the surface of something. But that could be an example of what that pop might sound like. Here's some student examples. So in this case, the student was photographing things that relate literally to music. So this is a record player, some headphones that kind of play along with that, thinking about a very quiet composition for them. This image feels very still to me, very quiet, very melancholy. Alec Castillo is a photographer that graduated from Appalachian State, and these are some examples that he has that I think feel radically different in a really intriguing way. So could you imagine the sounds that are present in each of these images? What might some of the similarities be, and what are the differences? And do they each emote a feeling? So there might be similarities of trees or nature in both, but one is much louder as this kind of motorcycle flies through the air, and it's giving us blur and motion there, as opposed to this small figure on a swing in a much quieter space. Another example from Alec Castillo, two examples. Could you imagine the sounds present in each of these images? What are the similarities? What are the differences? Do they each emote a feeling? So the same questions for these images, that kind of coldness of the snow, imagining being far away from that crowd up on the hill. Can you hear it in the distance, but maybe not distinguish any of the individual conversations? So this time you're going to take 15 minutes to explore and pay close attention to the sounds that you hear. How can you visualize those sounds in a way that your friends or family might understand that the feeling those sounds produce? You could also consider starting with a sound in mind, perhaps a song that you could create a visual representation from. Make at least 5 images of different sounds. Think about loud versus quiet, soothing versus tense, and any other notable differences that you perceive. And then if you're able to, since you probably already got your phone, think about making a recording of the sound as you make the images as well. And you could share those with the people that are kind of going to help you look at these images or maybe even critique them. So that's your first more conceptual prompt. You can pause here and come back once that's completed. And then this next prompt talks about thinking about how you could represent what fun looks like. So what does a good time look like to you? The first thing that you're going to do here is brainstorm a big list of everything you're doing for fun these days. Do you play video games, hang out with your friends, play sports, make things? Write down everything that you can think of, whether it's an everyday ritual or a special event. So take 5 minutes right away and write down that list before you even start making photographs. Just start to get ideas out on paper. Then you're going to go through that list. Which of these activities feels most compelling or unique to you and your friends, which might make interesting photographs. This is from a series I thought I would share with you. This is from when I was in undergrad. So I was probably around 19 years old when I made these photographs. And it was for a project where I was trying to think about relationships, and I thought it would just be kind of funny to get this big refrigerator box and put all these different relationships into that box. So I made about 15 or 20 images with all these different people that I knew climbing into this box. So think about how you can make photographs that are fun for you, or that might be an interesting experience, or even like a social experience. experiment, I guess. Here's some more examples that I think represent this idea of what fun looks like. So maybe it's literally playing a game. This sort of bubble bath experience is a great example. Think about constructing space again. So we talked about building a still life, but you could even think about this more dramatic version where they're cutting holes out of a backdrop and popping heads through it. This is the time when you could really build a photograph instead of the beginning of this lecture kind of talked about like hunting for pattern, hunting for the image that you want to make. And this is a section where you can kind of build what you want to have happen. Couple more examples here. I really love this FaceTime cell phone down in the bottom corner of this photograph. I think it's such an interesting way to think about what a photograph can be. Another kind of silly, goofy examples. Think about how you could set this up. They've used binder clips to clip this woman's hair up into this plant. Some of them are more, this one is, the opposite of what we were just talking about, kind of finding that fun. It seems like they're at a drive-in movie or something like that. So go have fun and make pictures and see what happens there. This is a series by Cornwagon Thunder where they're going out into the world dressed as Wonder Woman. And so it's again just like a silly experience that created some really intriguing photographs. Daniel Coburn, finding beautiful light, finding beautiful contrast, and also documenting this moment of pure bliss or pure joy. There's inspirations for me in the media all the time, so it's interesting to kind of go out and think about where you see something that is fun or interesting, and could you make photographs like that? This is from a Tierra Whack music video called Dora that uses, it was a collaboration with Alex DeCorta, who's a pretty famous artist as well. And there's another example here. This is another screenshot from some of her music videos where she's very playful in this sort of set design. So think about other examples in movies or books or TV shows that feel like moments of fun, and is there a way you could kind of play along or mimic those things to make your photographs as well? Juno Calypso is a photographer who did this whole series where she was going to motels and performing by herself in these spaces and making all self-portraits. So you can think about really elaborate setups where you're building a space and building a theme. She sort of builds this character. She doesn't claim that person as her. She's just built this person who's existing in that space. You can go look at her work in your own time and see more of those images in these really strange motel spaces that have big heart-shaped tubs or all pink or all red spaces that she's playing around in. Parker Day is making these portraits that are really dramatic and really over the top. So maybe you're someone who really enjoys dressing up or having fun with your friends or doing a whole makeover, and making images of those things could be an intriguing way to think about what fun looks like. Leonard Suryajaya is another artist. We've already seen one of his images where he's building these really elaborate scenes, lots of visual noise, lots of colors and playfulness. And I put his artist statement in here as well, similar to Carrie Scarbacca's, so we can see how artists might use a concept and then build out a whole series about it. So this was a series that was called Quarantine Blues. And this is his statement that says, America is in collapse. Are you sure you don't want to move back to Indonesia? My family begs me. As a queer millennial Chinese Indonesian alien in America, I realized that I gained some things and lost some things by staying in the US. But with no shortage of sad and disappointing images this year, I don't want to make work that features suffering as a main protagonist. Acknowledging the challenges of the global pandemic, social unrest, and transnational experience of anxiety and uncertainty, I make extravagant images with humble everyday objects in hopes of searching for an alternative outlook of our current time. And so instead of kind of leaning into the things that already feel sad and hard and overwhelming, Leonard is trying to think about how he could push back against that and make something that is fun and playful in the midst of things that are hard and difficult. This is more of his statement that says culturally coded material and personally coded objects are layered with humor to guide me in my reflection and exploration of isolation, identity, family, love, home, community, and health keeping, mentally and physically. One of the hardest things to do in art is make a joke, make something that is funny and makes sense to a wide range of people. So this is a pretty difficult prompt if you really buy into it. Couple more examples. I love how the example on the left, he's using a projector to project even more visual noise onto this building and set that he's built. And then on the right, he's wrapped everything in the room in wrapping paper. So really elaborate sets here. So some more things for you to kind of think about on this prompt. You could think about fun as rebellion. What does fun look like when you're not supposed to have it? Like teens breaking the rules or kids sneaking candy. A staged versus candid image. What's the difference between performing fun, like smile for the camera, and actually being in it? Funny versus fun. There's humor, irony, or absurdity. Explore comedy in the frame. Sometimes funny isn't joyful, and vice versa. And then maybe something like the aftermath of fun. Empty balloons, melted popsicles, glitter on a pillow. Photograph the aftermath of joy. Here's some examples from students. This was a really fun project where a student was kind of thinking about performing as his older brother and all the things that his older brother loved to do. This is a diptych, so making two images that are purposefully meant to go together, really playful, having birthday cake and toys all in the background. Another great example here, students made kiss prints all over this other person's face, so sort of a Valentine's photo shoot. And then this one's using another like editing app. They were using Procreate again to cut themselves out of an image and add themselves back into another one so that this student is in the image twice as the person holding the book and the person on top of the book. This is a double exposure example, which we've already talked about to make it feel even more chaotic or like the moment is happening right in front of us. You can also think about what the opposite of fun would be like. Sometimes when I'm not sure what I want to make a photograph of, I start with the opposite. What is the antonym of what I'm trying to do? So this is a really melancholy image made by a student where they're laying out in the snow and letting the snow even start to cover themselves up too. It's quiet, it feels sad. There's not much color in this image, and all of those elements play together to make the image not feel fun. Same thing here, much more melancholy image. Using black and white tends to have that effect as well. One more sort of quieter, more melancholy image. This is a really cool one because this student was using the panorama feature on a cell phone and sort of skipping back and forth. And it created these strange collages in real time. So you could think about breaking or misusing a tool so that it creates something visually interesting without playing by the rules necessarily. So you'll use that list of fun, the one that you created at the start of this particular prompt. You'll begin to think about when these activities take place. Take 15 to 20 minutes, maybe take a week, maybe take a whole month to think about these ideas and make at least 5 images that depict or document a few of these visions of play. That's all I have for you. A big list of elements and principles of photographic composition and a couple of more conceptual prompts to push you a little bit further. This is my contact information, so if you want to find me on my website or on Instagram, I'd love to see what you make. Feel free to send it to me or reach out. And thanks so much for spending this time with me. Have a great day.